thank you all for joining me for the session today, where we're going to be talking about how the company I work for, Wolters Kluwer, managed to adopt OpenTelemetry and move to observability, where we previously were a very vendor-heavy and vendor-laden company. My name is Chris Weldon. I'm the Director of Platform Engineering at Wolters Kluwer, working in tax and accounting North America. My accent, and you'll hear me throw out howdy and y'all a lot, is because I'm from Texas. So, now a moment from my sponsor. So, for those of you who haven't heard of Wolters Kluwer, don't worry, you're not alone. We're one of the biggest companies and stuff that very few people have ever heard of. That's the inside joke that we've got, at least, because we make software for a bunch of different verticals that support healthcare professionals, accountants, lawyers, finance people, et cetera, right? So we're a globally distributed company headquartered in the Netherlands. I'm very proud to work for this company, and a lot of other bodies and stuff think that we're great too. Equileap in particular has rated us #1 for gender diversity in the Netherlands and stuff for 3 years running. So I love to talk about my company, but that's not why we're here. If you're interested in learning more, come talk to me afterwards. One of the things that I am absolutely passionate about is mentorship, and in particular working with underrepresented groups, right? So I highly encourage any of y'all, if you're in a position to mentor somebody, please use that QR code and stuff to sign up for opportunities to mentor those in underrepresented groups, because it's super critical to the success of our community and our industry. So, let's talk about the agenda today. I'm going to set the stage. What was life like at Wolters Kluwer as it pertains to monitoring and observability? And how did we ultimately come to settle on adopting OpenTelemetry within our company, and how did we actually roll it out? What were the lessons learned, the burns and the scars that we collected and stuff along the way, and then ultimately how we ended up moving OpenTelemetry out of TAA North America and into the Wolters Kluwer enterprise as a whole, right? So there's a few assumptions that I have here in this particular talk. The first assumption here is that I imagine many of y'all are probably here because you know about OpenTelemetry, you know what it provides, and you may or may not be having troubles getting it adopted in your organization and getting it to scale, right? So I'm not going to cover any of the technology specifics behind OpenTelemetry. Furthermore, any of you who are in this talk and stuff hoping to see a lot of code examples beyond what I've got on the screen right here, I hate to disappoint you, but by the time that you leave this session, my hope is that you're going to feel that you've gained some ready-to-use knowledge on how to actually bring OpenTelemetry in successfully and roll it out amongst your teams, and that you feel enabled and empowered that you can do it too, because if we were able to within our enterprise, so should you. And if you particularly love this talk at the very end, maybe you might feel compelled to buy me a beer. So, our journey starts in 2020. Where Wolters Kluwer in tax and accounting in North America, we were primarily a monitoring-driven shop. Okay, so we had not learned and understood the value and the import of observability as a whole, right? So we had different tools that were deployed, in our infrastructure that I'm going to talk about in just a moment, right? But in large part, right, monitoring is an important critical predecessor to observability when you think about it, right? Because monitoring is all about collecting different telemetry data points and stuff and setting up alerts and looking at those to tell what problems actually are. And monitoring, when you have a really constrained problem set, right, with failure boundaries that are well understood, like this contrived example that I have on the left side of the screen here, it's totally fine for you, right? If you've got a simple web application and a database put on a single VM where you're not worried about RTO, RPO, high availability concerns, things of that nature, just simply deploying a few tools and using a monitoring strategy is more than sufficient. But as soon as you start to modernize your applications and move them to the cloud, things get a lot more hairy and complicated, right? You may end up with a set of legacy applications that are still around on virtual machines. Obviously, this is a Kubernetes conference and stuff, so you've got a lot of app dev that's happening in modern ways that are moving, that are deploying containers on Kubernetes or potentially other PaaS services that exist out there, right? And if you're not careful and you're not considering what is our operational monitoring strategy going to look like, you end up with technology sprawl as it pertains to monitoring tools, right? And that's kind of the state that we ended up in. If you look at and open up the hood of what are the technology tools that we had at Wolters Kluwer for monitoring our different systems, it's like the who's who of the solutions showcase out there, okay? We had a lot of different tools looking at a lot of different parts of our apps and infrastructure. The DBAs had their own sets of tools. Operations was responsible for setting up the APM and infrastructure monitoring. The devs did their own thing with logs, and it just kind of went haphazardly everywhere, right? So, but all the while, we're still modernizing our applications and introducing a lot of coupling and dependencies, whether it be with PaaS services, SaaS services, or even inter-service dependencies that we are building ourselves, okay? And so when something fairly low in the stack starts to have problems, as you can imagine, having all of these hodgepodge of tools looking at different parts of your infrastructure not connected whatsoever makes it very difficult to resolve incidents, right? You end up as the service owner that's at the edge where your customers are trying to use it, having problems. You're the first one to receive the call to get on the incident bridge. You're going to do your investigation up to a certain point and realize, you know what? This outbound call to the service that Team B owns is clearly the one having problems. Let's get Team B on the incident bridge. Twiddle your thumbs and wait. Okay, they're on the incident bridge. Get them up to speed. They do the same thing. It's a rinse and repeat until you go down the chain and realize you may have a low-level PaaS or SaaS service problem. So this was the state that we were in, where we had mean time to resolution that was not satisfying our customers or our business leadership. So where we were in our journey is, in 2020, we set out to say, we need to solve MTTR. We need to make it better. We also recognized we had just too darn many tools, and we weren't doing DevOps, right? So our journey was about how do we actually work together to reduce the scope of tooling that we have and to shift left, bringing monitoring and observability into the app dev teams, working together with operations to maximize the value of what we're delivering and not just thinking of it as an afterthought once we've deployed it into production, then we're going to deal with our monitoring strategy. And ultimately, we wanted to take a data pipelining approach to this. We really wanted to make sure that all of our telemetry data, we had the opportunity to process it, enrich it, filter it, sample it, right, and ultimately correlate the information on the back end. So, set the vision, April 2020. Fast forward, we're investigating the state of the industry, right? And we saw that OpenTelemetry and observability was a big thing that was coming about. OpenTelemetry at this point was, largely concluding its merge with OpenCensus and OpenTracing into a single OpenTelemetry standard. And while OpenTelemetry had a lot of its specifications still in the experimental phase, there were some parts of the standard, particularly tracing, that was fairly stable at that point in time. And the libraries that had been built up, particularly the .NET libraries, since we're a .NET shop, were also getting to stability very quickly. And so while we looked at the state, we also looked at the vendor space to see how were things there. The vendor space was also pointing to observability is the future, and OpenTelemetry is what many of the vendors were saying we are planning on moving to. So they gave us a lot of confidence internal to our enterprise that this was the strategy that we needed to adopt because we would prefer an open standard rather than vendor lock-in. That's one of the key principles that we had. Furthermore, we had to align our stakeholders internally on the principle of observability, moving away from a state of monitoring, realizing and stuff that we had to look at the whole to be able to quickly get to the answers of why is my system working the way that it is, rather than what are the different failure points, and let's start to play whack-a-mole in production to figure out how do we resolve these incidents, right? And thankfully, having that conversation with the operations leader stakeholder, the architecture stakeholders, and my engineering leadership stakeholders weren't that controversial. We all kind of aligned that this made sense in light of where we were trying to go. And then ultimately, though, we had to recognize that OpenTelemetry provides great standards and it provides great SDKs to emit traces, logs, and metrics, right? But it doesn't process that data. So we still need some place to house that data and process it internally. So we're still dependent on tools a little bit here, right? So the current tool that we were using, or the primary tools that we were using, did not support OpenTelemetry. So we had to go back to the drawing board and we said, okay, what were the tools that we wanted to evaluate here? And my dev teams went off and did some investigations. So we spent a couple of months evaluating a bunch of different tools. We came up with one tool that we really liked and started pressing forward and trying to bring it to production. And that's when our operations team said, hey, what are you guys doing? I thought we were trying to do DevOps here. Where were we involved in this journey, right? How do you know that this tool that you've selected actually is going to work for us for operations? Is it going to work for the DBAs, right? It was fair feedback, right? So we came together and formed a cross-functional team that was made up of operations, development, performance engineering, quality engineering, architecture, and this team we called the back-end bake-off team. Great fan of Great British Bake Off, not very controversial. This thing, highly controversial and stuff, but they worked really great together as a team to first start by identifying an inventory of the capabilities that we required, okay? And as a cross-functional team, that was the starting point, and we knew, just based on our experience from dev, that they're coming into this with bias, right? So the first thing that we had to do was flush out and make sure that each team was holding each other accountable and asking the tough questions to make sure that these capabilities weren't biased in favor of any one particular vendor. Once we identified this inventory, we then set off on a multi-month expedition to go through and assess from every one of these different cross-functional members' perspectives as objectively as possible, how well do these vendors meet these requirements, right? And then ultimately settled on what we felt was the right set of tools that we needed to move forward with, right? There was really one that kind of stood out to us, but this may sound a whole lot like I'm suggesting that we ended up with one tool to rule them all and in the darkness bind them, and that was in fact not the state that we were going for, because again, while I'm operating at my business unit level, we are also considering this for the enterprise, right? We have multiple dimensions of organizational leadership involved in this back-end bake-off, and had to recognize that across Wolters Kluwer, there are some business units, like the one that I was a part of, that had a very healthy budget for very expensive monitoring and observability tools. But other groups inside of the enterprise do not have the same budget and luxury. So their needs may also be much smaller, much more constrained architecture, right? And so their tooling on the back end may differ from what we are needing, but we just need to agree on a fewer set of tools than what we had previously. And that's the principle that we actually aligned on. The other thing too as well is that in software, there's no such thing as a silver bullet, right? So that's another reason why we were like, there's not going to be a single vendor tool out there that's going to meet all of our needs, because quite honestly, when you consider things like compliance checking, security, just the developer's perspective, operations perspective, performance engineer's perspective, right? If you're a tool that hits all of those checkboxes, you're generally a generalist tool, right? Otherwise, you're a specialist tool, right? And we need the combination of both of these tools to maximize the effectiveness. But underpinning all of this, and what I didn't actually show, was that at the top of this matrix here, it's really hard to see on the screen, the top three requirements are the tools that we're evaluating compatible with OpenTelemetry. These were non-negotiables. They had to support it in order for us to move forward. So we're now about a year in to our journey, right? And we've selected a tool, we've selected OpenTelemetry. Where do we go from here? And we had to step back before we just launched into execution and say, how do we make sure that what we are doing as a platform team is different than how we've behaved in the past? How do we make sure that we drive the enthusiasm and drive the successful adoption of OpenTelemetry and observability as a cultural strategy into our app dev teams, okay? And we had to figure out, how do we measure success in that regard? But one of the key things that we had to recognize was we had to minimize the impact to the app dev teams. It's not going to be zero. There is going to be some impact, right? We're changing their culture and their way of working after all, right? But how do we minimize it as much as possible? And the way to engineer this in the app code involved us forming and pulling together a pattern that we didn't come to find out until after we had executed was already kind of well-named and established, which was the embedded expert model that's shown down here. Got a link and stuff to the slides here from Pete Hodgson's blog post on this, right? But the basic gist is that the platform team doesn't know how to build, test, or run each of the different applications, right? We're not going to be able to swoop in here and stuff and pull off magic and stuff and make everything work, right? We need embedded experts to work with us to help us understand, how do we do this building, how do we test, how do we make sure that your application is running and has the right telemetry once we instrument it correctly. But in return, that app developer would learn about OpenTelemetry, about observability, about how the plumbing is actually working behind the scenes so that they can go back to the product team and share that knowledge with them and drive up the enthusiasm, the interest, and the awareness as that code makes its way to production. So let's start with logging. From a logging perspective, we went out, we did some analysis, and we found that most of the applications in our ecosystem were using a custom SDK that was already developed, because this custom SDK provided some easy connectors to get data like the user GUID, the context about the virtual data center that they're in, the database IDs that they are connecting to ultimately as a customer, right? And this is stuff that was ubiquitous across our app dev teams, right? So with the use of the custom logging SDKs, we had a central point that we could start making our modifications. And for teams that weren't using that custom SDK, most of them were already using more modern app dev frameworks that had configurable sinks, right? So again, easy points to be able to inject OpenTelemetry logging and stuff into our application stack. So what we ended up doing was, as the platform team, just simply making the code changes in those SDKs to first inject OpenTelemetry and add it as supplemental to where the logs were already going. Upgrade the SDK versions in all of the apps that were in scope, roll it out to the different environments. We did this first because as a means of convincing the app dev teams, we needed to make sure that they were confident that there was parity when their logs are no longer going to their existing destination and are going to the new destination, that they can see they have like for like, hey, I see all of my logs in the new destination that were there previously. I have trust that OpenTelemetry is working and that your new observability strategy is on its path to success. Once we had that critical mass and everybody saying, yep, we're good, we're not missing anything from what you've instrumented in the application, we went back into the SDK and ripped out the old plumbing, stopping the logs flowing to the existing system and now only flowing through OpenTelemetry to our new backend. So that's how we dealt with the logging rollout. Traces. Traces surprised us when we introduced it to the app dev teams, because most of the experience that, or the response we had from app devs were, why do I need traces? Logging is sufficient for me, right? And so when we looked at, okay, we need to figure out how do we educate people on the value of traces, right? We went in a very similar fashion to what we did with the logging process, where we actually injected in the app team's code the auto instrumentation SDKs and stuff from OpenTelemetry, right? So a lot of our application stack was WCF, Windows WCF services, which is SOAP-based services. But we also had some web API solutions as well that played nicely with different projects in the OpenTelemetry world. So once we injected that and deployed it into production for our first application, 3 days later, after going to production, there was a production incident, not caused by OpenTelemetry, okay? But in there, while the rest of the teams got onto the incident bridge and followed the existing patterns that they used to try to understand what was going on, I went in and started looking at the traces that we were already capturing. And within a matter of minutes, I knew exactly what services were causing problems. And in this particular instance, it was just a couple of hosts that had gone bad. So I was able to indicate to ops, hey, these couple of hosts are bad, right? And you need to take them out of the pool. We removed them from the pool. Service was restored in less than 15 minutes, right? Which, at that time, before we had fully introduced observability, was remarkably fast for incident resolution for us, right? And so we used that as an opportunity to evangelize to the app devs, this is the value of traces. This is how we used trace data to quickly understand where the problem was so that we could get to incident resolution faster. That was the moment, the light bulb moment, when everybody started to see, now I get it. Now I get why traces are so valuable in addition to the logs that you're already emitting, right? So there's definitely an education aspect to this, and unfortunately sometimes using a bad event, right, in this particular case, was a great way to illustrate how valuable adopting observability and OpenTelemetry as a solution can be to your organization. So the education was the bigger part and the bigger effort on our part to get adopted in our organization than actually the technology changes itself. But ultimately, besides using this as an exemplar for educating your teams, where possible, use the auto instrumentation SDKs. That is absolutely what we found worked in most of our circumstances. When it came to metrics, at the time that we were doing this rollout and the adoption, we didn't have many app dev teams who were emitting custom metrics, okay? And, let me make sure. No, I still got time. We didn't have teams and stuff who were doing a lot of custom metrics, and we didn't actually have a lot of stability in the OTel SDKs for metrics at the time. So we ultimately decided we're going to defer the implementation of metrics until we get a little bit more both stabilization in the .NET OTel SDKs, as well as when the app dev teams require it. Today, our SDKs that we're wrapping OpenTelemetry do support metrics, and our next stage is to rip and replace and stuff the agents that we're using for infrastructure metrics collection with those that are coming from OpenTelemetry so that we can be a 100% OpenTelemetry collector based solution. Now, speaking of the OpenTelemetry collector, this was the last piece of the puzzle here, right, to connect the data being emitted from the applications to the backends, right? So we focused on making sure that we didn't put the burden of figuring out OpenTelemetry collector deployment options onto the product teams. We needed to centralize that decision making because we wanted those product teams to focus on learning to use the new tools, learning observability, and using the SDKs to enrich their application telemetry, right? So in this particular case, centralizing it with the ownership with the platform team allowed us to make sure that we had consistency in our processing pipelines and our filtering and sampling rules, as well as we ended up deploying the collector service at the edge, which gave us new opportunities to be able to collect logs from the client's machines that are where we deploy and installable on client computers, rather than previously where all of those logs stayed local to their computers, and it was extremely painful between support and customers whenever we needed to figure out what was going on. They'd have to collect those logs, ship them over, send it on to an engineer and stuff. Now it's all available through OpenTelemetry in our backends. So, we've been rolling it out. What are some of the lessons learned here, right? our app teams were moving down a highway at 90 kilometers an hour. And we're coming in telling them, hey, we need to change this front left tire. But don't worry, keep driving, right? We're going to change your tire and stuff while it's driving. So as you can imagine, that's a very, very, very difficult task to do, right? So coordination with the app dev teams, even while using the embedded expert model, is really key, because otherwise you end up in situations where you have got conflicts, or in situations where the auto instrumentation SDK doesn't cover everything, right? You don't want to end up in a situation where the team thinks that you've deployed observability into production, but in fact you have coverage gaps because this new area of functionality did not get covered when you were working on it. Second, what's your culture of ownership? Do your teams, whenever they accept a pull request, say, I have to understand it, and then once I accept it, I'm going to actually fully support it? Or is it a culture where I'll bring it in, but you were the one who made the change, so if something goes wrong, I'm still going to come back to you because you're internal to the company? There are some things that you have to consider here. Depending on your culture of ownership, you have to figure out how do you properly enable those teams to do their own self-troubleshooting once you implement once you actually instrument their application with OTel, because otherwise you're going to end up in a spend cycle of supporting those app dev teams. Okay, we had a lot of logging libraries. You're going to miss some if you end up having a lot like we did, right? We covered like 85, 90% of the logging libraries when we switched over to OpenTelemetry, but we didn't actually notice that we had missed something until we saw all of that volume drop and move to our new backend, and we could see what did we miss. So plan to inspect and adapt through that, and that you're not going to get 100% upfront. Last but not least, if you deploy OpenTelemetry collector at the edge, right, for OTLP over HTTPS, and you have similar security postures like us where we have to deploy a web application firewall, your web application firewall might treat it like a denial of service attack. So you're going to have to tweak and tune your web application firewall and your OpenTelemetry collector and log configurations and stuff to create a balance and symbiosis there. When it comes to scaling to the enterprise, right? So we've been working largely inside of the TAA North American business unit right now, but how have I been taking this and stuff to the rest of Wolters Kluwer, okay? And the first step is doing something like what I'm doing right now on the stage with you all, right? It is talking about our experiences, sharing the benefits that we've received as well as the warts that came about from it. I've been trying to find multiple different channels internally within Wolters Kluwer, whether it be technology conferences, communities of practice, centers of excellence, teams channels, whatever, right? If you're trying to drive adoption in the enterprise, getting the word out is your first step. As you work through those channels, naturally, you're going to end up finding some enthusiasts who want to engage you on a deeper, more richer conversation because they may be trialing it themselves. Leverage that network because ultimately your community of enthusiasts and stuff will help to bridge you as an expert to others inside of your enterprise who may not be in your direct sphere of influence, right? That's actually kind of the stage that we're at right now where I'm starting to get connected to others in our larger enterprise who are interested in OpenTelemetry adoption, right? And who have been asking questions in forums that, quite frankly, I didn't even know existed inside of our enterprise, right? So this is kind of a gradual way of how you actually roll it out, form a community of practice. This all probably makes, to some of y'all are like, yeah, this seems like fairly straightforward, right? But as the pointy hair manager and stuff standing on stage right now, I will definitely say one of the last ways that you can absolutely drive impact, right, for OpenTelemetry, right, is if you're in a position where you started as a dev and now you're in a position to call the shots on what your team spends their time doing, absolutely support them in their efforts to make contributions to OpenTelemetry. Because that's in fact what I do. If my teams come up and say, hey, something in OpenTelemetry's got a bug or there's a feature that's missing, my first reaction is not go cut a ticket and wait for them to fix it. It's get in there and do it yourself, right? Because that's what we do as a community and stuff. We make it better for ourselves and for everybody else, right? So encourage your teams to do that. Ultimately, I got a couple, I'm right at time here. There are a lot of takeaways here. These slides are uploaded to Sked, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time here, and I'm going to skip to the final slide here to ask if there are any questions. But before we get to questions, feedback is a gift. If you liked this session, rate me. If you didn't like this session, tell me what you didn't like about it. It'll help me improve next time. And if you loved this session, I would love to have a beer with you and stuff later today. So, thank you. Where's the microphone? Oh, there it is. Anybody has any questions? All right. Ah, there's a microphone back there. What kind of backends are we using? So some open source, some vendor backends that I'm not allowed to say on stage, but they have quite a bit of a bark. Good question. All right. Any other questions? If so, go grab the microphone. There we go.
So maybe I missed it at the beginning, but I would be interested in the scope of your project. Was it one backend, 50 backends? How many stakeholders did you include here? What are we talking about?
Okay.
Because we have the same problem, but the problem is in our end-to-end chain, we have like 20 companies, and each company has 3 backends. Mm-hmm. And people are dreaming of a OpenTelemetry approach where everybody has standardized tooling for the 3 main areas, but it's, from a political point of view, seemingly impossible. So I would like to know how big your scope was.
Great question. Is my microphone still on? Yeah, I think so. Okay, so our business unit is somewhere between 40 to 50 app dev teams, right? So we're talking on the scale of 600 to 700 developers globally, right, in our entire ecosystem. As far as products are concerned, we build multiple product suites that serve the United States market and the Canadian market as well. And of them, from a engineering perspective, a lot of the decisions involved close collaboration with my chief technology officer. It involved his peer over in our operations team, which ultimately affected, I'm going to say, probably on the scale of 75 to 100 different operations engineers globally. And then from a broader operational leadership perspective, when I think about from the other global impact, we had architects at the global level that are responsible for, because we've trying to figure out how to simplify this, right? We have specialist architects that for the entirety of Wolters Kluwer globally, right, which is about we're 19,000 employees globally, and we have about, I think last numbers that I had were 9,000 engineers globally. We have a set of architects that are trying to look at the entire enterprise portfolio. Those architects were involved in this process of engaging with us during the evaluation of OpenTelemetry and the evaluation of the back-end tools and the strategy to simplify it. I would say that from a holistic WK enterprise perspective, right, not everybody is using, like I said, the same tools that we ended up adopting, all right? But where we've been trying to channel our efforts down to is to get to essentially a catalog of 5 or less different backends that we primarily support. Like, what is your large enterprise application solution for observability? What's your mid-size application solution for observability? What's your tiny application solution for observability, right? To meet the different budgetary requirements and to meet the different support requirements and stuff as you're scaling your application up to meet larger customer demand. But the one kind of central linchpin and stuff, again, to all of this is the recognition that OpenTelemetry as that open standard, that was actually not the controversial piece of this puzzle, right? Everybody agreed that the standard supports, since it supports multiple languages, right, that introducing that and trying to standardize on that and stuff made sense at an enterprise level. The challenge came into when to adopt, because ultimately, if you're still having to make changes to your applications, you're still having to do testing, things of that nature, that's engineering effort, right? That takes time and energy away from the business value proposition of your app devs, right? And so that's why I'm very eager about what's happening in the eBPF space and auto instrumentation outside of the applications perspective, because that's what I want my team to start working on next as we look more broader to the enterprise. Because if we're able to drive at least the tracing side and some of the metrics and logging, right, just through sidecar-based injection of OpenTelemetry, and the app dev teams don't have to worry about any instrumentation on their own, especially for legacy applications, all the better. But if you're a new application, you're doing greenfield work, our message right up front is use OpenTelemetry. No question about it. Hope that answers your question. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi, so I have a question about SIM monitoring and compliance monitoring, because we are in a situation
Need to get off the scene.
where...
I'm just going to say, if you could take more questions outside, if you're free, that would be great.
Yeah. Actually, sorry, I'm being told
No problem.
time is out and stuff. So I'll end up meeting over here and stuff, and we'll take questions outside so the next presenter can actually get set up. So I'll meet y'all down there. Thank you.